I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Charles had faced family fractures, public scandal, and the crushing weight of inheriting the crown. But nothing prepared him for the words inside the newly opened Royal Archive file. The room went silent. His hand stopped above the page. Because hidden within Queen Elizabeth II's private will was a provision no one around him expected, one that placed Princess Charlotte at the center of a deeply personal royal inheritance. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles read the decisive paragraph again, slower this time, as if changing the pace might change the meaning. It did not. The sealed archival packet had been opened during an internal review of Elizabeth's private estate, meaning the personal property she owned outside assets held by the crown. They were hers to leave as she wished, and she had left a protected collection of heirlooms, letters, and family possessions with preferential rights for Charlotte, placing the young princess ahead of other younger descendants for those personal pieces. Charles lowered the page. His mother had made the choice deliberately and without telling him. William saw the change immediately. He had entered expecting paperwork and another quiet administrative decision. Instead, he watched his father become painfully still. The prince's first instinct was to think of Charlotte, because the girl had no idea her name was sitting at the center of a decision able to reopen the king's grief. Yet he also understood why Charles looked wounded. Elizabeth had trusted her son with the monarchy, but here she had trusted something more intimate to another generation. That difference cut deeper than rank. It made the inheritance feel less like a gift and more like a message. Charles reached for the handwritten instruction attached to the will. In the documented note, Elizabeth explained that certain family memories had to be protected from future disputes and placed with someone who would value their emotional meaning above their status. Charlotte's name appeared again. William looked at his father, waiting for anger, but the king gave him silence instead. Then the archivist spoke. There was another sealed attachment. It explained why Elizabeth had chosen the girl, and it referred to a private incident from years earlier that almost nobody knew mattered at the time. Charles finally lifted his eyes and asked for the second envelope. His voice was quieter now, and William understood that the true shock had not yet arrived. Charlotte's inheritance had frozen the king, but Elizabeth's explanation was about to force him to confront exactly what his mother had seen before making her final choice. Charlotte did not ask to become the focus of another royal storm. She was still young enough for the adults around her to believe they could shield her from its full weight. Yet behind closed doors, Charles, William, Catherine, and Camilla now understood that Elizabeth had placed something enormous in the girl's future. And each of them heard a different message inside the late Queen's decision. William felt the danger first. Charlotte stood close enough to the direct line of succession for every decision around her to carry meaning. Yet she did not carry the immediate destiny waiting for George. That difference mattered. The succession, the legal order deciding who eventually inherits the throne, placed her behind her brother. But Elizabeth's private inheritance created another kind of responsibility entirely. She had not made the girl a future sovereign. She had made her the eventual guardian of deeply personal family history. And the prince feared the distinction would be twisted into rivalry. William told Catherine privately that he wanted their daughter kept away from every argument surrounding the will. He knew how quickly royal affection could be turned into a contest, especially when one child appeared to have been specially chosen. Catherine understood immediately. She felt pride that Elizabeth had trusted Charlotte, but beneath that pride sat unease. The princess admitted that her daughter had always listened closely when the late queen spoke about family memories. Yet she worried that those memories were now becoming expectations placed on a child who had never asked for them. Charlotte entered while her parents were speaking in lowered voices. William stopped mid-sentence and changed the subject at once. Catherine crossed toward her daughter and took her hand, trying to make the moment feel ordinary. But it was not ordinary anymore. The girl noticed the tension, even if she did not understand it, and the future king realized that protecting her would become harder the longer the secret remained inside the family. Charles was struggling with something different. The king now understood that his mother had not simply favored Charlotte with objects. Elizabeth had bypassed him as custodian of those specific belongings, meaning she had deliberately prevented a future reigning monarch from casually reshuffling them. That realization hurt. He had inherited her throne, her responsibilities, and the burden of protecting the institution. Yet she had placed this private piece of herself beyond his direct control. Camilla learned that several of the listed possessions were tied to Elizabeth's most personal memories. The queen consort immediately asked whether the will restricted who could borrow, display, or permanently redistribute them. Her question sharpened the tension, because nobody yet knew the full answer. Charles looked again toward the unopened second attachment. William did the same. That envelope contained more than restrictions. Buried inside it was a reference to one precise day when Elizabeth had apparently decided Charlotte should someday receive everything. To understand the choice that had wounded Charles and frightened William, the family would now have to return to one forgotten afternoon that suddenly looked like the beginning of everything. The answer did not begin with lawyers, inheritance rules, or palace politics. It began with a child, an elderly queen, and one quiet afternoon at Windsor that most of the family had dismissed as ordinary. Years later, Elizabeth's private note gave that moment a completely different meaning. What Charlotte said that day had stayed with her great-grandmother, and eventually shaped the decision now shaking Charles. Elizabeth had spent her final years separating what belonged to the monarchy from what belonged to memory. Some possessions were tied to the institution, meaning they carried official royal importance beyond any one person. Others were privately hers, heavy with stories that no title could explain. She knew those objects could become dangerous once affection, status, and value collided. That was why one quiet conversation with Charlotte mattered far more than anyone realized at the time. Charlotte sat with her great-grandmother during a private Windsor tea, when Elizabeth brought out an old family keepsake and told her the story behind it. The girl listened, then asked a simple question. Shouldn't something like that stay with the person who remembers the story, instead of simply the person with the highest title? Elizabeth went silent. She did not dismiss the remark. She looked at Charlotte and asked what she would do if something valuable ever caused the people she loved to argue. Charlotte answered without hesitation. She said she would keep it safe until everyone remembered why it mattered in the first place. Elizabeth studied her for a long moment. Later, in a private written account preserved among her personal papers, the Queen described the girl's instinct as protective rather than possessive. That distinction stayed with her. Charlotte had not spoken about ownership. She had spoken about responsibility. Elizabeth acted after Charlotte left. She requested her private writing case, removed an earlier inheritance instruction, and began rewriting the terms surrounding several personal heirlooms and letters. The newly opened archive now showed Charles exactly what happened next. That Windsor conversation became the direct trigger for the provision favoring Charlotte. His mother had not made the choice suddenly. She had made it because one small exchange convinced her the girl understood something the adults around her often forgot. Charles felt the sting deepen when he reached the final handwritten warning. Elizabeth stated that the collection must never become an instrument of position inside the family. The king understood the implication immediately. His mother had anticipated rivalry before it existed. Camilla reacted differently. She questioned whether a child's words should have carried enough weight to shape such a serious inheritance decision. Charles did not answer at once. But when she raised the question again, he knew the past had stopped being history. It had become an argument in the present, and the next conversation would put Charles and Camilla directly across from William and Catherine. Charles did not raise his voice when the family gathered privately. That made the room more dangerous, not less. The king had spent hours absorbing a message from his dead mother that seemed to reach past him and into another generation. William arrived, determined to defend Charlotte from becoming a symbol. Camilla arrived with questions. Catherine arrived, ready to stop those questions from becoming accusations. Charles had ordered the discussion before any wider household decision could be made. Only 4 people were present, and that mattered, because this was not yet a public crisis. It was a family argument about how Elizabeth's private wishes would be interpreted, administered, and explained. Administration meant the practical control of the collection, who protected it, who could access it, and who could make decisions about its future. Nobody in the room was openly asking to overturn the will, but everyone understood that interpretation could become its own kind of battle. Camilla turned directly to William and asked the question hanging over the table. Did he believe Charlotte should eventually control access to the entire collection? The prince did not hesitate for long. I believe the queen knew exactly what she was doing. The answer landed harder than he intended. Charles looked at him sharply. The king asked whether his son truly believed he would ever deliberately disregard Elizabeth's wishes. William immediately said that was not what he meant, but the damage was already there. His words had touched something deeper than authority. Catherine stepped in before the tension could harden. She told Charles that nobody doubted his love for his mother, and nobody was accusing him of betrayal. But Charlotte could not be turned into the answer for pain that existed before she was old enough to understand it. The princess said their daughter had inherited a responsibility, not a family dispute. William backed her immediately. He wanted the girl protected, not placed between generations. Camilla pushed the argument in another direction. She pointed to the restriction against redistribution and realized the wording could stop future monarchs from moving certain heirlooms into other family collections. That mattered because royal possessions were often reorganized across generations. But Elizabeth had deliberately blocked that possibility here. Charles finally stopped defending the structure and admitted what had truly wounded him. Charles said his mother never told him she had changed the arrangement. His anger collapsed into grief. He had believed they had discussed everything important during her final years. For a moment, nobody answered. The king pushed his chair back, stepped away, then returned and placed Elizabeth's handwritten note in front of William. The prince read the final paragraph slowly. It contained a personal instruction, asking her successor never to treat Charlotte's inheritance as a challenge to his authority. Elizabeth had anticipated Charles's pain with frightening precision, and the sentence she left for her son was about to decide whether this became a family battle or something far more profound. Elizabeth had not merely chosen Charlotte. She had built protection around the choice. Her private instructions separated affection from authority with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime understanding how quickly the two could collide. Charles now faced an uncomfortable truth. As king, he possessed enormous institutional power. But as a son reading his mother's final wishes, some decisions were no longer his to reshape. Charles remained alone after the others left, the handwritten note still open in front of him. He traced one small correction in Elizabeth's writing, then folded his hands and stared at the page. The archival instructions placed the collection under private trustees until Charlotte reached an appropriate age. A trustee arrangement meant designated people would protect and administer the property according to Elizabeth's instructions, rather than allowing the reigning monarch to rewrite the terms. That safeguard mattered because it separated royal authority from private ownership. The king could defend the crown, but he could not simply alter what his mother had chosen to do with what was personally hers. Charles felt the conflict more deeply because both sides of him understood the document. The sovereign in him respected order, structure, and control. The son in him saw something else. Elizabeth had anticipated disagreement, and had prepared for it without ever explaining the choice to him face to face. That silence hurt. He had spent years believing the most important matters between them had been spoken aloud. Now he was learning that one of her most personal decisions had been protected in writing instead. William later told Catherine that he refused to let Charlotte grow up believing she had somehow won against the rest of the family. The prince knew how damaging that idea could become. Catherine agreed immediately. She said Elizabeth's decision had to be explained as responsibility, never proof that one child had been loved more than another. The princess also knew George and Louis would one day hear about the inheritance, and she wanted them to understand that their sister had been given a role, not a victory. The next memorandum eased part of that fear. It made clear that George and Louis were not excluded from Elizabeth's affection or wider private arrangements. Charlotte was favored only in relation to this defined historical collection. Another clause went even further. Once mature, she could allow individual objects to be shared temporarily within the family, but she could not permanently dispose of them for prestige, leverage, or financial advantage. Charles made his decision quickly. He summoned the senior archive custodian and ordered that every item listed in the provision remain untouched until a complete inventory was produced. The custodian returned with the first serious problem almost immediately. One object was missing from the place where Elizabeth's records said it should be. The argument over intention had suddenly become a search for a missing piece of her legacy, and the first person informed would take that discovery personally. The inheritance had already shaken the family. Then one line on the inventory turned discomfort into alarm. A deeply personal object named for Charlotte was not where the archive record said it belonged. Nobody immediately accused anyone, yet the atmosphere changed instantly. Because if Elizabeth had carefully protected these possessions from future disputes, a missing heirloom raised the one possibility Charles least wanted to consider: that her wishes had already been disturbed. Charles reacted with anger before anyone could soften the news. The missing item was a small sapphire and pearl family locket containing a private photograph, one of the possessions specifically named for Charlotte's protected collection. The archive record showed that it had been moved during an earlier reorganization of Elizabeth's private effects, but the final transfer log, the written record showing where an item was sent and who received it, ended without a completed destination. That gap mattered. It meant the family could trace the locket leaving one place, but not where it had finally gone. William carried the news directly to Catherine. She listened without interrupting, then asked the only question that mattered to her in that moment: did Charlotte know? When the prince said no, Catherine let out a quiet breath of relief. She told him their daughter could not be allowed to believe she had somehow caused this search. William agreed immediately. Whatever tension existed between the adults, Charlotte would not be made responsible for it. Charles took the disappearance personally. The locket was not the most valuable object on the list, and that was exactly why his fury ran so deep. Its importance came from memory, not price. The king felt as though he had already failed one of his mother's last instructions before he had even understood it fully. That sense of failure hardened the room around him. Camilla felt the suspicion just as strongly. She told Charles she would not accept vague insinuations about possessions that had passed through several royal households. The queen consort moved toward the door, but he stopped her before she left. He said quietly that he was not accusing her. She turned back and answered that silence inside royal families could sometimes feel more accusatory than words. Charles did not argue, because he knew she was right. Then the search changed direction. The archive custodian uncovered an older signed transfer receipt showing that the locket had been sent for conservation months before Elizabeth's death. Conservation meant specialist repair and preservation designed to protect a fragile historical object without changing its original character. The receipt proved the heirloom had never been returned to its old storage case. The next ledger entry changed everything. Elizabeth herself had personally requested where the repaired locket should be delivered. It was not Buckingham Palace. It was not Windsor. It was not any royal vault. She had ordered it sent somewhere connected directly to Charlotte. The locket had never been lost at all. Elizabeth had moved it herself, and discovering why would finally force Charles to understand what the will truly meant. Charles entered the conversation, carrying days of hurt that Charlotte did not know existed. There were no advisors, no trustees, no archive officials between them. Only a grandfather and granddaughter, separated by decades of royal duty, and one decision made by a woman they had both loved. What happened next did not solve the legal questions. It solved something far harder: the meaning Charles had attached to them. Charles had already learned that the supposedly missing locket had never truly disappeared. It had been found inside a private memory box Elizabeth had arranged specifically for Charlotte before her death. The discovery mattered because it proved the late Queen had personally completed the transfer herself. The locket was not an accident in the records. It was the earliest sign that she had already begun placing part of her private legacy into the girl's future care. Charlotte listened carefully when her grandfather asked what she remembered about speaking with Elizabeth over old family keepsakes. The princess hesitated at first. She had begun to understand that the adults around her had been arguing over belongings connected to her great-grandmother, and that frightened her. She asked Charles whether she had done something wrong. His answer came immediately. He told her no. None of this was her fault, and none of the tension belonged on her shoulders. Charlotte then remembered something simple. She told him that old things had always felt important, because someone loved them before us. Charles went completely still. The sentence was not about ownership. It was not about rank. It was about memory. The king had spent days reading his mother's decision as something that had passed around him. Now the girl sitting in front of him was unknowingly explaining exactly why Elizabeth had made it. Charles opened the memory box and recognized the restored sapphire and pearl locket. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he told Charlotte that her great-grandmother had trusted her to remember stories, not simply to own objects. The princess looked back at him quietly, and for the first time since the archive was opened, the king stopped seeing the will as a judgment on himself. Charles finally understood the distinction. Elizabeth had not diminished his place in her life. She had given Charlotte a different responsibility, one centered on preserving emotional memory across generations. That realization broke through the resentment he had been carrying. The king made his decision soon afterward. He would personally uphold the provision, and he instructed the trustees to prepare a written family history for every protected object, so Charlotte would inherit context alongside ownership. That choice finally brought peace inside the family, but it also made secrecy impossible. Once the palace confirmed the arrangement internally, word escaped beyond the gates, and the private decision that had healed Charles was about to be transformed into a public storm. By morning, a private family decision had become a national story. Commentators debated succession, favoritism, inheritance, and what Elizabeth might have seen in Charlotte. But inside the palace, the family knew the headlines were missing the most important part. This was never about replacing George or weakening Charles. It was about memory. Still, one front page would turn that private distinction into the defining argument of the day. William saw it before Charlotte did. A national newspaper had placed her photograph beneath the enormous words, "Elizabeth's Choice," and copies were already being held outside Buckingham Palace, as people argued about what the late Queen had intended. The prince quietly removed the paper before his daughter entered the room. He wanted Charlotte to hear the truth from her family, not from a headline built to provoke. That mattered, because the inheritance concerned Elizabeth's private property only. It did not change the line of succession, the legal order determining who comes to the throne, and it gave Charlotte no new constitutional rank over George. Charles reacted far less calmly when the broadcasts began. One morning, presenter read the palace clarification aloud, explaining that Charlotte had been entrusted with responsibility for personal heirlooms rather than any new royal authority. Yet the king still hated hearing his mother's final intentions turned into public spectacle. Every discussion seemed to reduce a deeply personal act into a contest between generations. He considered a stronger denial, then stopped himself. An angry response could make Charlotte look like the problem, and he refused to let that happen. William backed that restraint. He understood that the public could debate symbolism without understanding the private grief behind it. The prince also knew George's position had not changed by a single step, but repeating that fact too aggressively risked making the children sound like rivals. Charlotte had inherited memory. George would inherit responsibility of another kind. Those truths did not need to compete. Charles eventually approved a measured palace statement. It affirmed that Elizabeth's private wishes would be honored in full, and that the king supported the arrangements surrounding Charlotte's future care of the collection. The wording was deliberate. It did not defend the decision as though it were controversial. It simply recognized it as final. Camilla read the statement beside Charles before its release. The queen consort paused when she reached the sentence naming his support. Then she told him quietly that he had chosen his mother's intention over his own hurt. Charles did not deny it. For the first time, he seemed at peace with that choice. The public argument was finally being separated from the private truth. But one decision remained. The headlines had made Charlotte a symbol. Charles now had to make sure Elizabeth's legacy did not consume the girl it was meant to protect. The story ended not with a legal battle, a palace defeat, or one royal triumphing over another. It ended with Charles accepting something far more difficult. Elizabeth's last private wishes did not need to confirm his authority to honor his place in her life. Charlotte had been chosen for a purpose that belonged uniquely to her. And once he understood that, the document that had frozen him became something completely different. Charles formally approved the archival and trustee procedures that would preserve every item exactly according to Elizabeth's instructions. The trustee structure, the private arrangement that allows designated people to protect property for someone until the proper time, would remain in place while Charlotte grew older. That mattered because the collection was never meant to become a burden placed on a child. It was meant to become a responsibility she could understand slowly, with the meaning of each object explained before control ever passed into her hands. Charles then gathered William, Catherine, and Charlotte privately. He placed the restored locket beside Elizabeth's handwritten note and told his granddaughter that both would remain protected until she was ready. William thanked his father for refusing to turn the inheritance into a contest between generations. The prince had feared exactly that from the beginning. Charles answered with a confession instead of a defense. He admitted that his first reaction had come from grief. He had felt left out of a choice made by his mother, and for a time, that pain had disguised itself as doubt. Catherine turned toward Charlotte and made the next part equally clear. Being trusted with family memories did not mean carrying the emotional weight of the entire family. The princess told her daughter she was still allowed to be exactly what she already was: a child, a daughter, a sister, and a granddaughter. Charlotte did not need to become the keeper of everything overnight. Charles went further. He confirmed the complete inventory, accepted every trustee restriction, and ordered that George and Louis receive copies of the recorded histories attached to the collection. The king understood that ownership could be divided, while memory did not have to be. Elizabeth's stories would belong emotionally to all three children, even where certain objects were reserved for Charlotte. And that became the final meaning of the will. Elizabeth had favored Charlotte within one carefully defined inheritance, but she had not ranked love. She had recognized something she wanted protected: the instinct to value the story behind an object more than the power that came from owning it. Charles emerged changed by that truth. He no longer treated his mother's decision as something that challenged his reign. He protected it as one last expression of her independence, judgment, and love. Charlotte had not replaced anyone. She had not outranked anyone. She had not won. She had simply been trusted. And so the document that first left Charles frozen ultimately did not divide the monarchy at all. It reminded one king, one family, and one young princess that the most powerful inheritance Elizabeth left behind was never possession. It was trust. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.